So hello, everybody that's here on the call on this webinar. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Keneilwe Tsotsotso. I'm the Senior Course Coordinator at Digital Frontiers. It's so good to see all of you, some of the names that we know and some new people. So basically, I know that we will be having a very fruitful engagement. Please take note that you can use the Q&A button if you have any questions that are there. Feel free to also use the chat box. We want to make this, it's a webinar, but we also want to make it as interactive as possible for you so that you can ask questions or what you need to. So I've introduced myself. I will have Nolwazi and Fola introduce themselves. Over to you, Nolwazi.
Thank you, Keneilwe. Nice to see a familiar name in the attendees list. Hello, Linda. We are former colleagues from the Central Bank of Eswatini. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. And also thank you so much for joining us today. As Keneilwe said, my name is Nolwazi. I work with Keneilwe Digital Frontiers and Digital Frontiers Institute as the Deputy Director for Financial Regulation and Supervision. So when it comes to the topic and I see policy, I get very excited and interested, and it draws my attention into the discussion. So I'm excited to see what the discussion holds for us today, and I'm looking forward to engaging with you also through the comments in your chat or your questions in the Q&A. As I said, I'm a former regulator with the Central Bank of Eswatini. I've done quite a few webinars and published a few papers within the scope of financial regulation and supervision. I've worked with CGAP and Toronto Center in different programs, and I've worked as well with other stakeholders that we've worked with to develop or continue improving our various courses under our CDFP portfolio and our instant and inclusive payments portfolio as well. Let me hand over to you, Fola, for you to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Nolwazi, and thank you, Keneilwe. Happy to be on this panel, and hello, everyone. So, brief introduction. My name is Agbejule. I'm based in Lagos, Nigeria, and my background is in digital financial services with a focus on women financial inclusion. So it's been an interesting journey working with women, working with the stakeholders and developing gender policies with the Central Bank of Nigeria. And I also have a full-time consulting role with CGAP, which is housed within the World Bank. Yes, so we are the financial inclusion think tank of the World Bank, and I also support on some policy areas and with the different pillars across World Bank. So it's interesting to also, we've seen the evolution of different women empowerment, looking at policies over the years, and also recently whereby Nigeria was at the forefront, of women's financial inclusion, developing the framework for access to finance for women. So we hope some of this discussions, both on the financial inclusion side, digital financial services side, economic empowerment side, some of those discussions and some of these insights will be really interesting to today's discussion. So let's enjoy the discussion and follow the process. Over to you, Keneilwe. Thank you.
Thank you, Nolwazi and Fola. So just to touch on actually the topic and to give you some background knowledge, is that today's topic, as you will see, is about challenging international women's economic empowerment trends by exploring current gendered policy designs. So what we're going to be doing is drawing on the latest research and policy developments. And this webinar basically looks at those topics. And one of the topics that is so close is that we need to look at the role of policy design in shaping women's economic opportunities and outcome. We'll be critically analyzing existing policy frameworks and their limitation. We will also be looking at strategies for engaging key stakeholders and promoting cross-sectoral collaboration. So I would like to hand over to Nolwazi to discuss basically the role of policy design in shaping women's economic opportunities and outcomes.
Thank you so much, Keneilwe. I think for me, this discussion starts off at the very beginning in discussing exactly what definitions are. So if you're going to discuss and ask the question, what is the role of policy design in shaping women's economic opportunities and outcomes? You ask yourself, okay, we're basically trying to achieve gender equity, or are we trying to achieve gender equality? And then the next question is, what is equity? What is equality? And the main difference between the two is that equity takes into account that each person has different circumstances, whereas equality assumes that everyone in the population is homogeneous and will get to the same outcome as the people who are in equity. And so then we need to take a step back, because if we're designing policy under the mindset of gender equality, are we not doing our people a disservice by assuming that they all are in the same circumstances and somehow they will all achieve the same outcome? So in policy design, yes, we are guided by the SDGs, and they've laid out a good path for us, where goal 5 is the one set out for women and girls and women's empowerment. And we're working towards it. And it has different targets and indicators that help guide policymakers in making decisions on how to draft their policies and draft legislation that will impact the country. But I think in every case, since we're given a template, we must remember that this is a working template that is supposed to be adjusted such that your country can work towards gender equity. So this is the challenge to each country, to start thinking about, okay, we've been given a gender equality template. Let's take it and challenge ourselves to make it gender equity for us, or women's empowerment for us, or DEI achievement goals for us. So I think one of the key things to start off is there in your policy design. Apart from the major and most important thing is that policy design is nothing without stakeholder collaboration. So another thing is that the gender equality or women's empowerment or women's economic empowerment has not been a big priority until of late. Of late, you've seen that women's economic empowerment or gender equality has become a very, very big priority. And you're seeing a lot of publications from the digital financial services scope of work. You're seeing it from climate change scope of work. You're seeing it in diversity, equity, and inclusion scope of work. And it's growing, which is excellent, because now we can have these discussions and discuss how we can challenge international women's economic empowerment policy designs, because we're not just limiting the scope to the financial sector. Even in our work within digital frontiers, we're not limiting our scope of work within the financial sector. We're looking at inclusive digital economies, where women need to be included in tech and ICT more. And we've seen some work there by the World Bank, where there's funding to train more women in cybersecurity. But that can only go so far until countries need to put this now in legislation to ensure that, apart from moral suasion, which is where mostly we've been going on with, there's now regulation and supervision, or rather regulation, disclosure, and supervision, to ensure that we really are making the key steps for women's economic empowerment. So let's go back to the policy design. Sorry, I'm a teacher, so sometimes this will come across in the way I speak. So in policy design, you're thinking, where's the stance of the country? Is there one? Now we need to frame one. Then if you're writing legislation, in what ways do we want to, what mechanisms do we want to put in place to see women's economic empowerment? How do women need to be empowered in our economy? Where are they majoring in? We see that most small businesses in micro businesses and economies, especially developing countries, are run by women. So maybe we need to start a micro business fund and make sure that there's adequate supervision to make sure that these women are empowered in this direction. Climate change affects these women because most of these small businesses or micro businesses are in agriculture. Let's ensure that these climate risks are hedged so that these women are protected from these climate risks and they are empowered. And you think about also another way in policy design. You've got your national, your strategies that countries produce: national financial inclusion strategy, national digital strategy, national fintech strategy. All of these need to be deliberate in how they include gender equity, women's economic empowerment, because we can only see this real change once it is written down and not only spoken about, so that it can be implemented once it is written down. So we can also see this in challenging regulators to not just live with the status quo and be happy with discussing, yes, we just want gender equality. No, we need to challenge our country's regulators to want gender equity for our countries. And I'll stop here and give the floor back, Keneilwe. You're on mute.
Thank you so much, Nolwazi, for kicking off this discussion. You've really highlighted points that a lot of people don't look at, and particularly, as you've mentioned, we need to know the difference between equality and equity, and we need to hold basically the regulation sector upfront, that they understand that these are the policies that we're looking at and how to make sure that they are actually designed for women economic empowerment, and they are not just put in place to look good on paper. So I just want to then hand over and talk about or look at Fuller. Fuller, how would you say we can critically analyze existing policy frameworks and their limitations in your words?
Okay, thanks, Keneilwe. So first, I think it's just important that we recognize that a lot of policy frameworks for women, especially in financial inclusion, or even cutting across different economic empowerment indices, fine, they were developed with the intention of reducing some of the gender gaps and the gender barriers. However, we'll realize that these policies only address just a part of the key barriers faced by women in accessing most of this services or intentions. There are still, and one of the limitations, for example, in some of the existing policy frameworks that I've seen, is that they focus solely on increasing access to some basic services. Let's take maybe financial services, for example, without considering the status of the women, like the cultural factors, the social, the economic factors. These are things that shape women's decisions. We're not looking at the people within their network. Who do they look up to? And we've done different research, at least as recent times, and different projects that we've worked on, whereby we saw that when we have the project, which is targeted at men and women, but we wanted a certain percentage for women participation. When we were not able to, most times on such projects, we're not able to get those percentages. And drilling down, we realized that we needed to, for us to get the women, we needed to get them through the men or the male figures that they looked up to. So these are some ingrained cultural biases that these policy frameworks are not considering. That's just an example. So additionally, I would also say that the many existing policy frameworks are not taking into account, the different levels of digital literacy that exist among the women. There's a need to train these women. We are looking at it that, it's when the policy, just like when product managers in private institutions are developing products and just sit on their desk in their offices without going to the field to interact and engage with the audience they're developing the products for. This also happens in policy, and it's also a major barrier whereby they're not taking, the regulators often at times do not take into account the different levels of probably literacy, digital literacy that exist among these women. And this also exacerbates the limited access. And one more thing that I'll talk about is existing policies at times overlook the importance of us developing targeted products or targeted policies for women. We can't have a blanket there are many times we have a blanket approval, blanket policy, one size fits all approach. That has not achieved the kind of results we want over the years. And this is like a good time to start rethinking and changing them. So what about financial literacy and education for the women users or for the women themselves to improve their own economic development? How do we close some gender gaps? How do we build specific policies? And also remember that one of the challenges we've seen is there are times that it's not like the policies are not there. There are reports, in the policies when the framework is coming up, we say you must have this for women, you must be focused on women. It's just like, what about in the monitoring and the supervision? How do we ensure compliance? How we monitor to ensure that the returns coming back to the regulator on this policy framework actually captures what we want to see for women. So, I'll just conclude by saying that, all the existing frameworks and the policy frameworks are the ones that will come out are important to help us provide like a solid foundation to build upon. But it's always important for us to prioritize gender sensitive designs. In terms of policies, we should also recognize the very critical role that these women are playing in the society, and also the importance of closing the gender gap in the different economic empowerment indices. So let me stop here and hand over to Keneilwe.
Thanks, Fola. This is definitely a topic, and I love how you and Nolwazi have basically integrated this. Maybe Nolwazi, you'd like to jump on that.
Thank you, Keneilwe. And I completely agree with Fola. And just wanted to add on this, when you look at gender policies or gender legislation as well, as adding to what Fola was saying, it reminded me of Juan Carlos's work. I don't remember the co-author, if there is one, on outcomes-based consumer protection legislation or outcomes-based consumer protection. The paper he wrote on that, and it talks about the 4 outcomes mainly being on suitability, choice, fairness and respect, and voice. And I think those outcomes could be adapted in how you look at women and tailoring policy design for them around women's economic empowerment. And how would these look like? You talk to the women, as Folasade say, and tailoring it to them by giving them a voice, showing them respect and fairness by ensuring that everything is designed through respecting their voice, listening to them, understanding that in different cultures, like I'll take my own, the man is the head of the household. In most cases, he is the one who runs the money in the house, and the wife asks him for permission to pay for certain things. He allocates the money for groceries. And so why would a woman in Eswatini would initially in the olden days would ask, why do I need a bank account? And so you register me, great, I have access, but I'm not using it because my husband is the one who's in charge of finances. So then you go back and you think about choice. Maybe there's a different context of women that you're thinking of now, the women who are running their agriculture business. Maybe they want to find a service that supports exactly what they need. You've listened to them. The product that they're receiving is fair. It respects their integrity. But now, do they have a variety of products that supports them? So this is where in finance, the question of why did fintech come in is that fintech came in to answer the question of choice, to modularize banking or to break down banking, and we see banking as a service now where fintech has broken down different services offered by banking so that people can ask for what they need in certain parts of banking, but not necessarily have a full banking suite, where you can have budgeting apps or savings groups apps, where a lot of developing countries have stokvels or savings groups, and that an account for that would be more relevant for them than a full banking suite for international travel per se. And then the last one, as I'm working on it, is suitability. And that as well, as I end on this, it takes away the onus of this discussion away from the providers and away from the consumer, and make sure that the women are catered for and that they're thought of, but at the same time they're not excluded from the discussion, as they're still maintained as a key stakeholder in this discussion. And so these policy designs are not made by high-level people who see themselves as, I know the most and I know best, but they're integrated discussions, I think, that will produce the best outcomes for women in achieving the increase of increasing their economic empowerment. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Nolwazi. And I think some of the things or the key issues that you've raised, at a certain point, everybody was screaming human-centered design, human-centered design. And that was the focus, I think, specifically last year. But I think we need to go back also sometimes to the drawing board and think about women-centered design for these kind of financial products, because it's linked to what they need. So just saying human-centered design is not enough. And that's what we really also need to get down when it comes to looking at financial services that we produce and the kind of policies that are put in place. So just a follow-up question.
Sorry. One
go ahead.
In response to Keneilwe, just chime in on what Nolwazi said on suitability. That is really interesting. You know, the same way the financial services providers are also analyzing, you know, their products in terms of suitability, I think the policy makers also need to start looking at this angle to actually, you know, because a lot of times that we've seen regulations that instead of enhancing, you know, uptake of services by women, or instead of enhancing economic development for women, it actually does the negative, which are not the intended consequences. So there's actually a need to also consider all these other segments, look at what is happening, focus closely on the women. If possible, let's interact closely on ground as we are, you know, looking through the policy frameworks and the designs, and tweak as the need. Okay, over to you, Keneilwe.
Thanks, Fola. And I'm just reading in the chat box, and a topic that's really being, if I can pull out, is looking at the monitoring gaps. And I think it would be nice just to get insight from you, Nolwazi and Fola, is that how do we basically mitigate and make sure that we get rid of these monitoring gaps?
Okay, you want me to go?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I think some of the, you know, just thinking through and running through all of this, I'm looking at it that there's actually a need to develop and implement gender responsive budgeting, you know, like a procedure to translate the policy goals itself into budgets and the measures that we need, so that everything is gender sensitive. And we need to break down all the goals. Like, you know, when we are developing policies, we have our policy goals. We know what we want to achieve. So how do we even break this down so that it is clear for everybody to say, especially the operators that are on the ground and working closely with the women? Another part of it is also about encouraging women's employment and women's participation in the labor market. You know, promoting decent work, helping us to narrow the wage gap. Fine, because so much these things, policy may not be able to solve everything, but how are we able to create economic autonomy even for women? What are the other areas whereby we can also support the men to ensure, you know, to help to promote some of the work-life balance and give more space to the women? Remember that recall that I think in recent times, especially in Nigeria, we've had a lot of discussions around parental leave. which are policies that can actually help to reduce burden of caring for children for women. Some of these policies, if they are in place, because we should look at policies holistically that cut across different phases and different walks of life. So if we're able to invest in that, it will stream down to other areas where we really need the economic empowerment for women. One last thing will be, what about investments in education and training for the girl child and the women? Because we've had some research in recent times whereby we've seen that women are in different age groups. So even for policies, we shouldn't just look at women overall, just talk about women. No, we have different age groups, and these different age groups are very critical to how they engage with different products, different services, and different outlooks. So understanding the different phases in the women's lives. So how do we invest from an early stage, especially in training and education for the girl child, which should definitely include both technical, vocational skills? How do we ensure that they have access to, gender equity or gender equal opportunities, as the case may be? And lastly now, what about leadership? When it comes to leadership, how we increase the representation of women across the different sectors? Because this is actually a vital step towards promoting, gender equality. There should be some policies. In recent times, we've seen that these policies are coming up. Yes, they're coming up now, whereby there's some quota even on the board to say this should be women. But, we also need to invest in those women from an early age, so that it's not just about completing a quota, but they also have a voice on that board or wherever you put them, because they've been empowered and they've been educated enough to handle those roles. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Nolwazi, let me hand over to you just to chime in there.
Yeah, because I was about to say Fula has said most of it. I think for me is also to add that the qualitative data that we could add to this from the women's side, doing some surveys to get to hear from them what their needs are in terms of what do I think I need to learn? What do I think I need to add to my literacy or empowering me to grow in leadership? Because you find that sometimes the men also want to be allies, but they don't know how. And I like what was put in the Q&A, where Alfred said, how about equity-centered design instead of women-centered design, which means men are being left behind. It gives you some thought there to something to chew on, because everyone wants to work together in solving this challenge. But then at the same time, it kind of seems like there's a fight where there isn't, or competition where there isn't. We just want everyone to be at the same level playing field and have the same opportunities, chances, and status or rights. And that's currently not the case, as with different contexts and so on. I just want to add, I think this might be a relevant paper to read, and it looks at the financial sector. It was written by a former colleague and friend of mine, and Jeffrey Young from the BIS FSI. It was published under the FSI Insights, where they talk about diversity, equity, diversity and inclusion within the financial sector, and how supervisors can work on this. And it talks about disclosure requirements and how they touch on how those can be handled. And it's an interesting discussion because, yes, it's not easy quite now to put, hey, slap a template, because it's hard at the moment to even conceptualize. No one's everyone's still working on it, on saying, okay, we do have, for example, national financial inclusion strategies, and this is how we plan the reporting of them to see where the money budgeted went. The link is in the discussion, Alfred. Oh, let me paste it again. There's the link. Oh, host and panelists, sorry. Everyone, there we go. There we go. So, yes, as there's the budgeting for national financial inclusion strategies, the same work needs to go in for women's economic empowerment data. The whole work from, as Fola had said, from budgeting, working towards developing all of those indicators. But I think another way we can also get ahead of it is, again, I'm sorry, I'll reference this paper because I loved it so much. And I think the work done with the FSCA on this work was so amazing, is also learning from the new consumer duty that the UK just published mid last year on outcomes-based consumer protection as well. And it uses the 4 indicators and see how they're doing their measurement, and maybe start from there in learning how we can start doing measurement for women's economic empowerment or gender equity data or equality data, and also learn from that where there's an outcomes-based approach that is being measured, and see how we can take those learnings to also make an outcomes-based approach for gender data being collected, and see how we can make it make the data collectible on our side. But that's quite abstract, and maybe we can see how we make that more practical with time. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Nolwazi and Fola. You know, you've raised such important points, and I can see even in our chat box, Bridget is saying that this is a wonderful discussion. So thank you so much for that. Now, I think for me, there are so many of, if I can say, solutions that we are coming up with. But I think I would like to, let's think about the limitations actually. And sometimes working with the limitations or seeing limitations can actually foster the solutions that are there. So I guess for me is, what limitations have you seen, specifically, if I can say, Fola, in Nigeria? What limitations have you seen in existing policy frameworks?
So one, like I said, one major limitation that I've seen is whereby the policy is not considering the cultural, the social, and economic factors that shape women's decisions, you know, as well as the biases that they may hold. I mean, if we just speak, because, you know, we're used to doing things the way we've been doing it, creating policies, you know, just making it to cut across. You know, we discussed something yesterday. Those that are even developing these policies, how many of them are actually women, or even live with women, or are mindful of, you know, those important biases or norms that control some of these women's decisions? And that's one of the courses, you know, the gender. Sorry, I'll still go back to the gender equality course for digital financial, the DFI, you know, the Digital Frontiers is handling this course. And you know, I've seen men on the team or in the classes and the cohort that, you know, when they talk about the course, you see that this is really eye-opening. So there's actually a need, even for the policymakers, to take courses for gender, you know, gender equality, gender equity courses, so that they are always mindful of one of the most important limitations, which is those barriers, the social, the cultural, and the economic factors that I say, you know, inhibit or shapes the women's decisions and may actually inhibit some of the uptakes of these processes. So we need to also, you know, many times these policies do not take into consideration the different levels, the digital literacy, the even the education level. What is important to the women? How do they make decisions? What you are really focusing on in this policy, does it really matter to these women, or it's a deal breaker? You know, how are we looking at those things and putting the women into perspectives? You know, the existing policies, some of the existing policies, let me not say a lot, tend to overlook the importance of all this and just, you know, go ahead with the policy. So some of these things can actually be really important to help us, you know. So these are the limitations to really know what's going on. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Fola. Thank you, Fola. And I think I'm going to pose the same questions to you, Nolwazi, and I think I just want to really narrow it down to if you can give us just practical examples that you have seen in your experience, especially being as a regulator and a policy designer. What are those key limitations that are there?
So key limitations on the policy design. I think sometimes, as much as we want to talk about the limitations on the policy design, it's also, we also need to remember that maybe it's because I'm a former regulator, you'll say I'm partial, but the regulators themselves need resources to be able to do the better work. You find that there's limited staffing, practical things. There's limited staffing, there's limited budget internally. And so as much as they'd like to go and talk to the women and get engaged with the communities and understand exactly what's going on the ground, there's not enough people in the team to do it. There's not enough people because then one person will be doing the job of 5 people. And that's one person. And so those are real challenges that you'll see on the ground, that we really want to do the work. We want to do the work. There's not enough budget to hire another person because the budget has been fixed. Or you find that another challenge is it's hard to reach some of these people. Some of these areas are very rural. You want to go there, but what car are you going to get that's going to reach that place? Or maybe you want to get to speak to some of these women and maybe you want to engage with your team, but the area is so rural that the network doesn't even reach you in those areas. And so that's another challenge. There's limited infrastructure in some areas. And so you can't engage with the women. It's not that you don't want to, but these are physical or some intangible or intangible challenges that are limiting regulators from reaching or policymakers from reaching these goals in the policy design. And some challenges are, just assuming that, when you actually need to be, your literacy needs to be improved. I remember there was a paper published by Dalberg. They did a study with CGAP on how policymakers learn, and they grouped them into 4 categories, and they discuss how most of them prefer, like the leaders or the bureaucrats or the people that make decisions, they prefer learning in short bursts and so on and so forth. So sometimes it's the way that the capacity building is developed for them that's also a challenge, because you've developed all the capacity building, the knowledge is there, but the way it's designed, they don't want it. And so maybe you can say that's a flimsy excuse, but at the end of the day, it's happening, it's real life, and it's every day. And that's a challenge that needs to be addressed, because that challenge is resulting in this challenge of today.
Yeah, and Nolwazi, so a practical example that I have for the monitoring limitation that you spoke about, we're speaking with one of the regulators, and this regulator was telling us that there were times that, I think these were microfinance institutions, there were times the only reason they knew that a microfinance institution had closed its operation, there were smaller ones, and then there were like over 1,000 of them, was when some of them just strayed into the bank, to the central bank, to say, hey, these guys could refuse to pay me, that kind of thing. Because how do you manage 1,000? How many staff, what resources do you actually have to go across all these places? And that is the human resources. So that is for monitoring, field monitoring and visitations that require human resources. Then what about the knowledge resources? There are times, innovation is very fast now, very fast. And the regulators are trying their best to keep abreast of this innovation. Before the innovation and the regulation and policies were usually ahead of this. The policies will come, then the products follow. But now the products have gone into the 3rd phase. Before the regulation is not saying, hey guys, what are you doing? Can you just stop it here? So now, and that's why across all aspects, insurance, financial services, or the regulatory sandbox is actually very important and interesting. So you have an innovation, come, let's test it here in this controlled and safe manner, and let's see how it goes. So there are a lot of limitations, not just, in terms of resources, human resources, knowledge resources. Some landscapes of countries have done this, you have not done it. What about a field visit and see how have you guys been able to develop these policies and what can we learn? Being mindful of the context of our own, of the peculiarity of our own country, and the list goes on. Thank you, Keneilwe and Nolwazi.
Thank you for that, Fola. We've already touched on some of the solutions that we're looking into, especially when it comes to policy design and making sure that it's really 100% aligned with fixing the limitations that are currently there and policies that are not working. I'm interested to find out from you, Nolwazi, what best practices would you recommend in terms of promoting gender equality?
That's a very loaded question, Keneilwe. That is a very loaded question to ask someone. Wow, there is no one silver bullet to answer that with, because that is so wide and far-reaching. I mean, we've tried to answer that in this webinar when we've been talking for 45 minutes already, and we're no nearer to getting to the solution than when we began. That is a very loaded question. Please ask it again.
So in your experience, right, what are basically solutions or best practices, let me say, coming from regulation and central bankers? What can they do actually to promote gender equality, specifically in the economic sphere? So what best practices would you recommend?
Okay. Can our attendees join us in speaking?
They aren't able to do that, but they are able to put it in their chat box, which I think will be very interesting to get more insight on what they are thinking, because at the end of the day, we are here in a webinar and we're giving solutions. However, like you say, gender equality is so broad. It's so broad, and we are here to come up with those best practices. So it's a challenge.
I'll have at it. Yeah, I'll ask Linda to answer this question with me. So looking from the regulatory lens, starting off, the flow of the mechanism is from policy to regulation to supervision and enforcement. And so obviously then that's how you'd want to start it off. Make it deliberate, intentional from policy, so that the mechanism flows down to the business practices, to the disclosure, so that you see it as the outcomes for the women on the ground being positive, such that when you get feedback from the women, the demand side, not the providers, which are the supply side, when you engage with the women, you're getting the positive outcomes from the 4 categories of voice, fairness and respect, choice, and suitability. Are they really getting positive outcomes from that? So that we're seeing that their empowerment is actually increasing. So how does that get done? We make sure that women are included, even from innovation. If anyone is testing a product in the regulatory sandbox, in the application, there must be explicit gender requirements that are met to even be able to qualify to test in the regulatory sandbox. To be licensed, there must be specific gender targets to get the license to participate in any function or any provision of services within the financial sector, within any sector in the economy. And there should be explicit leadership targets for women to be met within any business in the economy. So this can be in a regulation, in a rule. Obviously, it depends if the act that's there allows for extra rules or regulations to be written under it, or whether that act itself needs to be amended. And so that can then require disclosure of the companies. Unfortunately, you'll hear them complain, oh, the cost of regulation is increasing. However, then the regulators need to find that sweet spot where it is proportional, because that's why we have risk-based proportional reporting. That way, you're not overburdening the smaller companies with the same type of reporting as bigger companies. And so also, as you think about how does this look like in everyday life, and then if you're looking at climate risk, how are climate risks being protected? How are like financial institutions investing in businesses that are led by women? This is constant in monitoring and evaluating. So this function can move now and be monitored by the Conduct Authority or the central bank, however the country is structured, and such that, because this is on the line at the end of the day of protecting women and making sure that their voice is heard and that they are seen, and that there's equity in the economy, that it is understood that women are under different circumstances. Already women are being abused. Women start at a lower advantage in most economies. Women start off being seen as lesser than. We're starting off at a lower point of the race, at the back point of the race. And we have to at the same time get to run the apparent same 100 meters and reach the same distance. So that gap needs to be covered for, so that and be made explicit that we know that this is gap. I think another challenge is that no one wants to acknowledge that the gap is there. We just want to acknowledge it kindly and then move on. But this gap needs to be explicitly acknowledged so that it can be solved. So I think, let me pause there so I don't take too much of Fola's time, as our time is running out. Thank you.
Okay, so let me just briefly, I think I'll just, when it comes to, we're talking about some best practices to promote good gender policies. I would just look through, thinking through, looking at our gender equity course again. What about the policymakers themselves? What about having like an audit of the gender policies that are available, or even the policies that are available on different topics? What about doing like a critical audit from time to time and saying, how well did we include here gender practices, or how well did we put women at the center of this policy? Was there a focus on them, or it's just a blanket approval and free for all? So that is one of what I think we can always do, always ensuring that these policies are non-discriminatory and they're inclusive of the genders. So that's the major, I think, the straightforward approach I would use to evaluate looking at gender policies. I'm mindful of our time, so let me stop here. We only have 8 minutes to go.
All right. Thank you, Nolwazi and Fola, for that. Just touching on what you were talking about now, Fola, regarding gender audits. And I think it's people take gender audits lightly. And there's a reason why it's called an audit, so that you're able to monitor and see actually if this policy is truly working. And we need to make sure that they are audited, but it also comes back goes back to who's doing the auditing. Do they understand what they are auditing? And this is where you need to also have somebody who's designated to do that work, to make sure that this is working or not, So it goes back to how do we monitor and actually evaluate if a policy is truly working. And it means that we need to be intentional, 100% be intentional. And I like what Namatai did say, and which you spoke about this, Nolwazi, is explicit leadership targets, meaning that if we have true targets, especially with the leadership that's up there, then it creates a ripple effect, especially going down. And with the targets, if you align it with the audit, then you are definitely going to be in a place where a change will be made and you're able to identify where the gaps are, because currently you're running on systems that are running on gaps, but nobody even knows that it's a gap to start off with. Sure. All right, so in the chat box also, we have a couple of comments, particularly from Bridget, stating that it is important to design projects which are tailor-made to accommodate each and every one. And, you know, adding on to what Alfred was talking about, this can go back to gender equity or gender equity-centered design, so that we also bring on allyship, that we promote it, because that's where most of these decisions are being made, in the boardroom full of men. So how do we also make sure that we are capturing them into this conversation? And one of the ways is, yes, moving into equity-centered design. She also mentions most financial institutions, they don't consider the economic gap between men and women. They ask you for collateral for you to get a loan and some privileges, which some women do not even own or have the means to it. So yes, I know we are running out of time. So I think we have gotten to the part where I would love to think about your closing remarks in this discussion. And yes, we've touched on best practice, but it would be nice to hear your summary of where to from here, that it is not just another webinar, where to from here, and the advice that you can give our participants.
Okay, I can start. I think in the heart of all the discussions, I would like to conclude by talking about data. You know, also as policymakers, we need to be mindful of data in all the policy to inform the policies. You know, from time to time, evaluate the existing policies, then use data, at least from the operators which we supervise, and see how we can collect and analyze this different data, you know, on gender and the work in general, so that we can get the context to even say, where are we? This can help us to do some evaluation, some self-evaluation and assessment from time to time, you know, and it also help us to identify like root causes of whatever imbalances or disparities that we've experienced in the journey so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Fola. Over to you, Nolwazi.
Thank you, Keneilwe. I must say this has been by far the best webinar I've been in. I've enjoyed this time so much. Thank you for inviting me, Keneilwe. I think to tie up everything for me, I think what matters most in this discussion is intentionality in everything that's being done. Intentionality drives all of our discussions today. I've quite enjoyed your comments, Fola. Thank you so much. I've learned so much from you. And I really think in intentionality, this will drive the policy home for women's economic empowerment, and drive home gender equity, and and drive home really the desired outcome, which is gender equity, gender justice, such that we understand that every situation, every circumstance is different, and we cannot assume that everyone is the same and can reach the same outcome. We must take account not only that every country is different, but every person is different, and that's how we'll win. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nolwazi and Fola, for coming into this webinar. I think you've really answered some of the questions that so many people have on their mind. And I like the fact that we have challenged a lot of policies or that are implemented specifically when it comes to creating digital financial products or any just regulatory policy. So it's good that we are at a place where we can actually see that there are gaps, there are limitations, and that there has to be something intentionally done from top to the bottom in order to ensure that we are mitigating if I can say, the two poles on the other end. So with that, I'd like to thank you so much, Fola. Nolwazi, this has been a wonderful conversation. And please just know that we will be sharing this recording with you. You'll be able to access it also on the Digital Frontiers platform. And if you want any more information or to be contacted or to contact one of our speakers, information will also be there put in the recording post so that you can engage with them. One thing I know, what we always say is that gender is ongoing, policies are ongoing, and you can't just cover it in just 1 hour. So if you have any questions, please do feel free to reach out to us. Thank you so much, everybody, to all our attendees.
Thank you.
Yes.